Sometimes the most terrifying discoveries hide in the most innocent places. A small fabric patch sewn onto a vintage jacket. A faded photograph tucked inside an old book. A handwritten note folded between the pages of a diary. These seemingly harmless objects carry within them the power to shatter everything we thought we knew about the people we love, the places we call home, and the very foundation of our existence. What if the grandfather you adored, the man who taught you to fish and told you bedtime stories, wasn't the gentle soul you remembered? What if the quiet neighborhood where you grew up held secrets so dark that even decades later, mentioning certain names could make grown adults fall silent? What if a single piece of cloth could unravel a web of lies so complex that it would take you across continents and through decades of buried history? This is the story of how one ordinary afternoon, while cleaning out an estate sale purchase, a simple discovery turned into a journey that would challenge everything one person believed about family heritage and the thin line between good and evil. It's a story about how the past never truly stays buried, and how sometimes the people we think we know best are the ones hiding the darkest secrets of all. The truth has a way of surfacing when we least expect it, wearing the most innocent disguise. Sarah Matthews never expected her Saturday morning routine to change her life forever. At 32, she had settled into a comfortable pattern of weekend estate sales, hunting for vintage treasures to flip online. Her small apartment in Portland was cluttered with finds waiting to be photographed and listed. It was a decent side income that fed her love for history and old objects with stories to tell. The Brennan estate sale was advertised as a typical downsizing event. Mrs. Dorothy Brennan, according to the listing, had passed away at 90.1, leaving behind a house full of decades' worth of accumulated belongings. The Victorian home on Elm Street drew the usual crowd of dealers, collectors, and curious neighbors. Sarah arrived early, as was her habit, scanning tables of china, books, and clothing with a practiced eye. The military jacket caught her attention immediately. It hung on a makeshift clothing rack between a moth-eaten fur coat and several outdated dresses. The deep green wool was well preserved, with brass buttons that still held their shine. What drew her closer was the craftsmanship and the obvious age of the piece. The cut suggested it was from the 1940s, possibly European in origin. Sarah lifted the jacket from the rack, feeling the weight of quality fabric. The lining was intact, a rich burgundy silk that spoke of expensive tailoring. As she examined it, her fingers detected something unusual near the left breast pocket. A small rectangular patch had been sewn over what appeared to be the original placement of military insignia. The patch itself was unremarkable at first glance. Dark fabric, roughly 2 inches by 3 inches, stitched with careful precision. But something about it felt deliberately concealing, as if someone had taken great care to hide whatever lay beneath. Sarah held the jacket up to the morning light streaming through the estate sale tent, trying to see through the covering. Mrs. Henderson, the elderly woman running the clothing section, noticed Sarah's interest. Her weathered hands clutched a small metal cash box as she approached with a friendly smile. "That's a beautiful piece, isn't it?" Mrs. Henderson said, adjusting her glasses. "Dorothy's late husband, Frank, brought that back from his time overseas. He passed in 1987, but she kept all his things exactly as he left them. Said it made her feel like he was still around." Sarah nodded, turning the jacket to examine the shoulders and sleeves. The construction was impeccable, the kind of attention to detail that suggested military issue rather than civilian tailoring. "Do you know which branch he served in? Or where he was stationed?" Mrs. Henderson's expression grew slightly uncertain. Dorothy never talked much about Frank's war years. Said he didn't like to discuss it, that it brought back difficult memories. You know how that generation was about such things. They kept their pain private. The price tag read $25, reasonable for a jacket of such quality. Sarah calculated the potential resale value, thinking of the collectors who sought authentic military pieces. But as she prepared to agree to the purchase, her curiosity got the better of her. "Would it be possible to examine this patch? It looks like it might be covering original insignia that could help identify the unit or country of service, Mrs. Codd." Henderson hesitated, glancing around as if checking for eavesdroppers. Her voice dropped to almost a whisper. "Dorothy specifically asked that nothing be altered or examined too closely. She said Frank had his reasons for arranging things the way they were, and that some things were better left undisturbed." The response only heightened Sarah's interest. In her years of buying estate sale items, she had encountered protective family members before, usually guarding items with sentimental value. But there was something different in Mrs. Henderson's tone, a nervousness that suggested more than simple sentiment. Sarah paid for the jacket and several other items, including an old leather-bound journal and a carved wooden box. As she loaded her purchases into her car, she found herself repeatedly glancing at the military jacket lying across the back seat. The covered patch seemed to draw her attention like a puzzle demanding to be solved. Back in her apartment, Sarah spread the jacket across her dining room table under a bright lamp. She photographed it from multiple angles, documenting its condition and details. The brass buttons bore no identifying marks, and the interior pockets revealed only the lingering scent of old tobacco and something else, something medicinal and unfamiliar. She had developed a network of contacts over the years, including Professor David Chen at Portland State University, who specialized in military history. David had helped her identify several pieces in the past, and his expertise had proved invaluable in determining authenticity and origin. Sarah sent David the photographs along with a message describing the estate sale and Mrs. Decease. Henderson's reluctance to discuss the jacket's history. She mentioned the concealed patch and asked if he might have insights into why someone would cover original military insignia. David's response came within hours, and his tone was more serious than usual. He asked if they could meet in person to discuss the jacket, suggesting his office rather than their typical coffee shop meetings. The urgency in his message surprised Sarah, who had expected a straightforward historical discussion. When she arrived at David's office the following Monday, carrying the jacket in a protective garment bag, she found him waiting with several books open on his desk. His usually cheerful demeanor seemed subdued, and he examined the jacket with unusual intensity. "Sarah, this type of alteration, the careful covering of insignia, it's not uncommon, but the reasons behind it can be complex," David said, running his fingers along the edges of the patch. During and after World War II, many soldiers removed or covered their unit identifications for various reasons. Some were protecting classified information. Others were trying to distance themselves from certain associations. He paused, looking directly at her. Some were hiding participation in units they later regretted serving with. The weight of his implications settled over the room. Sarah had read enough about the war to understand that not all military service had been honorable, that some soldiers had been involved in activities they or their families later wanted to forget. "Are you saying Frank Brennan might have been involved in something questionable?" David carefully set the jacket down, his academic caution evident. "I'm saying that deliberate concealment usually indicates something the person felt needed hiding. The quality of this jacket, the European cut, the time period, it could represent any number of scenarios. But given Mrs. Henderson's reluctance to discuss it and the family's specific instructions about not examining it closely, he trailed off, allowing Sarah to draw her own conclusions. They agreed that she should do some research into Frank Brennan's background before making any decisions about the jacket. David provided her with resources for military record searches and suggested she start with basic biographical information. That evening, Sarah began her investigation at her kitchen table, laptop open beside the jacket. She started with public records, finding Frank Brennan's obituary from 1987 in the Portland Tribune archives. The brief notice mentioned his age at death, 73, and his survival by wife Dorothy and his sister in Minnesota. It stated that he had served in the military during World War II but provided no specific details about his service. Working backward from his death date and age, Sarah calculated that Frank would have been in his 20s during the war years, prime age for military service. She found property records showing that Frank and Dorothy had purchased their Elm Street home in 1949, suggesting they had married and settled in Portland shortly after the war ended. The trail seemed to dead end there, until Sarah remembered the carved wooden box she had purchased along with the jacket. She had set it aside without examining it closely, focused as she was on the more obviously valuable items. Now she retrieved it from her purchases box, wondering if it might contain additional clues. The box was about the size of a hardcover book, made from dark wood with intricate carving along the sides. A small brass latch held it closed, and when Sarah opened it, she discovered it wasn't empty as she had assumed. Inside, nestled in faded tissue paper, lay a collection of small items that immediately made her pulse quicken. There were photographs, black and white images that appeared to be from the 1940s. A few showed groups of young men in military uniforms, but the images were too small and unclear to make out faces or identifying details. Among the photographs was a small piece of paper with what appeared to be German text, words she couldn't read but that seemed official in nature. Most intriguing was a small metal object wrapped in cloth. When Sarah carefully unwrapped it, she found herself holding what appeared to be a military medal or insignia, unlike any she had seen before. The design was intricate, featuring symbols that seemed vaguely familiar but which she couldn't immediately identify. As she examined each item under her desk lamp, Sarah realized she was no longer looking at a simple estate sale find. The carefully hidden patch on the jacket, the mysterious box of mementos, the family's insistence on leaving things undisturbed. It all pointed toward a story much more complex than an elderly veteran's reluctance to discuss his war service. She photographed each item in the box, creating a digital record before carefully returning everything to its original position. Then she sat back, staring at the jacket spread across her table, and wondered what Frank Brennan had been so determined to hide. The next morning she called David to tell him about the box. His reaction confirmed her growing suspicion that she had stumbled onto something significant. He asked her to bring everything to his office again, and this time he wanted to involve a colleague from the history department who specialized in European military units of the Second World War. As Sarah prepared to leave her apartment, jacket and box in hand, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was about to cross a line from which there would be no return. The simple pleasure of finding and reselling vintage items had evolved into something much more serious, something that might reveal truths that had been deliberately buried for decades. She thought about Mrs. Henderson's words at the estate sale, Dorothy Brennan's specific instructions about leaving things undisturbed. Had Dorothy known what her husband was hiding? Had she spent decades protecting a secret that died with her, only to have it surface again through the randomness of an estate sale? Standing at her apartment door, Sarah made a decision that would change everything. Instead of simply trying to identify the jacket for resale purposes, she would pursue the full truth about Frank Brennan's war service, no matter where it led or what it revealed about the quiet man who had lived on Elm Street for nearly 40 years after the war ended. The jacket felt heavier in her arms as she walked to her car, weighted not just with quality fabric and careful construction, but with the burden of secrets that someone had gone to great lengths to conceal. Sarah was about to learn that some discoveries change not only what we know about the past, but how we understand the very nature of truth itself. Professor Elena Vasquez had spent 30 years studying the darker chapters of World War II history. Her office in the basement of Portland State University's history building was lined with books in multiple languages, filing cabinets full of research, and photographs that most people would find disturbing. When David Chen called asking her to examine some artifacts, she expected another routine identification request. The moment Sarah unwrapped the jacket and opened the wooden box, Elena's demeanor changed completely. Her usually warm smile faded as she examined the photographs, and when she saw the metal insignia, her face went pale. "Where exactly did you get these items?" Elena asked, her voice tight with concern. Sarah repeated the story of the estate sale,
Mrs.
Henderson's warnings, and Dorothy Brennan's specific instructions. As she spoke, Elena's expression grew increasingly troubled. "Sarah, I need you to understand something very important," Elena said, carefully setting down the insignia. "What you found here, these aren't just random military artifacts. This insignia, the way the jacket has been altered, the careful concealment, these are indicators of something very specific and very serious." David leaned forward in his chair. "What are you seeing that we're missing?" Elena picked up the metal piece again, holding it under her desk lamp. "This symbol, the design elements, they're consistent with certain specialized units from the war. Units that were involved in activities we now classify as war crimes."
The room fell silent.
Sarah felt her stomach drop as the implication hit her. "Are you saying Frank Brennan might have been a Nazi?" "I'm saying these artifacts suggest connections to units that operated outside conventional military rules," Elena replied carefully. "The deliberate concealment, the family's protective behavior, it all fits a pattern I've seen in other cases where family members discovered uncomfortable truths about loved ones." Elena opened one of her filing cabinets and withdrew a thick folder. Inside were photographs and documents relating to war crimes investigations that had continued decades after the war ended. After 1945, many people involved in questionable activities tried to disappear into normal lives. Some changed their names, others moved to different countries. Still others simply removed all evidence of their wartime service and reinvented themselves as ordinary veterans. She showed them photographs of men in military uniforms, some with insignia similar to what Sarah had found. The accompanying documentation detailed investigations, trials, and in some cases, ongoing searches for individuals who had never been brought to justice. The problem is that, by the time these investigations reached their peak in the 1960s and 70s, many of these people had been living as respectable citizens for decades. They had families, businesses, community standing. Exposing them meant destroying not just their lives, but the lives of innocent family members who had no knowledge of their past. Sarah stared at the jacket spread across Elena's desk. "So Dorothy might never have known?" "It's possible. It's also possible she suspected but chose to protect the life they had built together. Or she might have known everything and decided that the man she married was different from the man he had been during the war. Elena explained that the period immediately after World War II had been chaotic. Record-keeping was often incomplete, identities were sometimes fluid, and the massive displacement of people across Europe created opportunities for individuals to reinvent themselves completely. Someone with military experience, language skills, and the right connections could easily create a new identity. Frank Brennan might not even have been this person's real name. The revelation hit Sarah like a physical blow. She had been thinking in terms of a war veteran hiding unpleasant memories, not someone who might have been living under a false identity for 40 years. David examined the German text from the box, comparing it with reference materials Elena provided. This appears to be some kind of official document, possibly transfer orders or service records. The Gothic script is consistent with German military documents from the period. Elena took photographs of everything, explaining that she had contacts at the Simon Wiesenthal Center and other organizations that specialized in war crimes research. She could share the images with experts who might be able to provide more specific identification. But I have to warn you about something, Elena said, looking directly at Sarah. If these artifacts do connect to war crimes, you're going to face some very difficult decisions. There are still active investigations into war criminals, and any new evidence could potentially reopen cases that have been dormant for years. Sarah felt the weight of responsibility settling on her shoulders. What kind of decisions? Whether to report your findings to authorities. Whether to contact Holocaust survivor organizations. Whether to try to identify victims or living relatives. Whether to simply put everything back in the box and forget you ever found it. Elena's words hung in the air like a challenge. Sarah realized she was no longer dealing with a historical curiosity, but with potential evidence of real crimes against real people. There's something else you need to consider, Elena continued. Frank Brennan, if that was even his real name, lived in Portland for nearly 40 years after the war. He had neighbors, friends, possibly colleagues who knew him as a good man. If your investigation proves he was involved in war crimes, it will shatter a lot of people's understanding of someone they cared about. Sarah thought about Mrs. Badger. Henderson's protective attitude at the estate sale, the way Dorothy Brennan had insisted that some things were better left undisturbed. Had Dorothy been protecting her neighbors and friends as much as her husband's memory?
On the other hand, Elena said, if crimes were committed, don't the victims and their families deserve to know the truth, even this many years later? Don't we owe it to history to document what really happened, regardless of how uncomfortable it makes people? David looked between the two women, clearly sensing the moral complexity of the situation.
What would you do, Elena, if you were in Sarah's position? Elena was quiet for a long moment, studying the artifacts spread across her desk. I've spent my career researching this period, and I've learned that there are no easy answers. I've seen cases where exposing the truth brought closure and justice to survivor families. I've also seen cases where it destroyed innocent people and accomplished nothing positive. She picked up one of the photographs from the box, examining it closely. What I can tell you is that the truth has a way of surfacing eventually, whether we help it along or not. DNA testing, genealogy websites, digitization of historical records. All of these things are making it harder for secrets to stay buried. Elena suggested that Sarah take time to consider her options before making any decisions. She offered to begin preliminary research while Sarah decided how far she wanted to pursue the investigation. If you decide to move forward, I can connect you with experts who specialize in this area. There are proper channels for reporting potential war crimes evidence, organizations that handle these investigations with appropriate sensitivity to all parties involved. Sarah gathered the artifacts, her mind spinning with questions she had never expected to face. As she prepared to leave, Elena handed her a card with contact information for several organizations. Whatever you decide, don't try to handle this alone. These are complex historical and legal issues that require expert guidance. Driving home through Portland's afternoon traffic, Sarah found herself looking at the city differently. How many other Frank Brennans were there? How many ordinary-seeming people carried secrets from that terrible period in history? How many families had built their American dreams on foundations they never understood? That evening, Sarah spread Elena's reference materials across her kitchen table alongside the artifacts. She read accounts of war crimes trials, descriptions of various military units and their activities, and explanations of the complex legal and moral issues surrounding post-war justice. The more she read, the more she understood Elena's warnings about the lack of easy answers. If Frank Brennan had been involved in war crimes, he had been dead for over 30 years. Justice in any legal sense was impossible. But was there still value in uncovering the truth? Sarah thought about the other items she had purchased at the estate sale. things that had belonged to Dorothy Brennan. The leather journal she had bought contained what appeared to be Dorothy's handwriting, documenting daily life in Portland during the 1950s and 60s. The entries painted a picture of an ordinary couple, living an ordinary American life. But now Sarah wondered what might be hidden between those ordinary entries. Had Dorothy recorded any hints about her husband's past? Had there been conversations, nightmares, unexplained behaviors that might have suggested the truth? She opened the journal and began reading more carefully, looking for any references to Frank's wartime service or anything that might indicate Dorothy's knowledge or suspicions. Most entries were mundane, recording weather, social events, household activities. But as Sarah read deeper into the journal, she began to notice patterns. Frank apparently suffered from what Dorothy described as difficult nights and troubled sleep. There were references to him avoiding certain movies or books, becoming upset when war topics were discussed on television or at social gatherings. Dorothy had attributed these reactions to normal veteran trauma, but now they took on a potentially different meaning. One entry from 1963 caught Sarah's attention. Dorothy had written about Frank's reaction to news coverage of war crimes trials taking place in Germany. According to her account, Frank had become extremely agitated and had left the house for several hours without explanation. When he returned, he had insisted they cancel their subscription to the newspaper and stop watching television news. Sarah felt her pulse quicken as she read Dorothy's description of the incident. The behavior Dorothy had interpreted as general discomfort with war coverage could have been something much more specific and personal. Another entry. Frank had handled the conversation himself, after which he had told Dorothy they were going to take a vacation to visit her sister in Minnesota. They had left Portland the next day and stayed away for 3 weeks. The pattern that emerged from Dorothy's innocent journal entries painted a picture of a man who lived in constant fear of discovery, who monitored news and avoided attention in ways that suggested he had something serious to hide. Sarah closed the journal and sat back, staring at the artifacts spread across her table. Elena's warning about difficult decisions echoed in her mind, but she realized the decision had already been made. She couldn't unknow what she had learned, couldn't pretend the evidence didn't exist. But she also couldn't proceed recklessly. Too many people, both living and dead, could be affected by whatever she discovered. She needed to approach this investigation with the same careful methodology that Elena and other researchers used in their work. Sarah picked up Elena's card and the contact information for war crimes research organizations. Tomorrow, she would begin making the calls that would either confirm her suspicions or put her fears to rest. Either way, she would finally know the truth about the man who had lived as Frank Brennan. As she prepared for bed, Sarah took one last look at the military jacket hanging in her closet. Tomorrow, that small patch would be carefully removed, revealing whatever Frank Brennan had spent 4 decades trying to hide. The truth was finally ready to surface, bringing with it all the complex moral and emotional consequences that Elena had warned about. Sarah had started this journey looking for vintage treasures to resell online. Now she was about to become part of a historical investigation that could reshape understanding of not just one man's life, but the hidden legacy of war that continued to influence families and communities decades after the fighting had ended. The following morning, Sarah met Elena at the university's textile conservation lab. Elena had arranged for them to use professional equipment to carefully remove the patch without damaging whatever lay beneath it. Dr. Miranda Shaw, the lab director, had experience with historical garments and understood the delicate nature of their investigation. We'll use steam and specialized tools to loosen the adhesive and stitching. Dr. Shaw explained as she prepared her workspace. If there's anything underneath, we'll preserve both the original and the covering. Sarah watched nervously as Dr. Shaw began the painstaking process. The patch had been applied with extraordinary care, the stitching so fine and precise that it was almost invisible. Whoever had concealed the original insignia had possessed considerable skill and had clearly intended the alteration to be permanent. As the steam softened the threads and adhesive, Dr. Shaw worked with tweezers and tiny scissors to gradually separate the patch from the fabric beneath. Elena took photographs at each stage, documenting the process for potential future reference. After nearly an hour of careful work, Dr. Shaw successfully lifted one corner of the patch. Beneath it, they could see a flash of metal and color that made Elena inhale sharply. "Stop," Elena said, her voice tight with recognition. "I need to make some calls before we go any further." Sarah felt her stomach clench. "What did you see?" Elena stepped back from the work table, her face pale. "Enough to know that we need expert guidance before proceeding. The insignia underneath, it's exactly what I was afraid we might find." While Dr. Shaw carefully repositioned the patch to protect the underlying material, Elena made several phone calls from her office. Sarah could hear only one side of the conversations, but Elena's tone was urgent and serious. She mentioned words like potential evidence and immediate consultation. When Elena returned to the lab, she was accompanied by a man Sarah hadn't met before. He was tall, in his 60s, with graying hair and the bearing of someone accustomed to authority. Elena introduced him as Dr. Samuel Roth from the Simon Wiesenthal Center. Dr. Roth specializes in Nazi war crimes research, Elena explained. I've worked with him on several previous cases. When I described what we might be dealing with, he agreed to fly up from Los Angeles immediately. Dr. Roth examined the partially revealed insignia through a magnifying glass, his expression growing grimmer by the moment. I'm afraid Elena's suspicions appear to be correct. What we're looking at is consistent with insignia from the Waffen-SS, specifically units that were involved in some of the worst atrocities of the war. The words hit Sarah like a physical blow. She had been hoping for a more benign explanation, perhaps a regular German army unit that had simply been on the losing side of the war. The reality was far worse than she had imagined. Before we reveal the complete insignia, Dr. Roth continued, I need to explain something about what this could mean and what responsibilities it might create. He led them to a conference room where he spread out materials from his briefcase. The documents included photographs of various SS insignia, unit histories and case files from war crimes investigations. The Waffen-SS was responsible for some of the most horrific crimes of the Holocaust. Dr. Roth explained, if Frank Brennan was indeed a member of one of these units, it means he was likely present during mass murders, deportations, and other atrocities. Sarah stared at the photographs on the table, images of uniformed men who looked disturbingly ordinary, like people she might see in any grocery store or neighborhood. But he lived peacefully in Portland for 40 years. He was just a normal person. That's exactly the point, Dr. Roth replied. After the war, thousands of war criminals successfully reinvented themselves as ordinary citizens. They got married, raised families, built businesses, and became respected members of their communities. The banality of evil, as Hannah Arendt called it. Dr. Roth showed them case files of other investigations, men who had lived quiet lives for decades before their wartime activities were discovered. Some had been teachers, businessmen, even respected community leaders. Their post-war lives of apparent respectability didn't erase their wartime crimes.
The question now, Dr. Atavich,
Roth said, is what Sarah wants to do with this information. If we complete the examination and confirm what we suspect, this becomes potential evidence in ongoing war crimes research. Elena added her own concerns. There are also the people who knew Frank Brennan to consider. His neighbors, friends, anyone who might have looked up to him or cared about him. This revelation will be devastating for them. Sarah felt overwhelmed by the weight of the decision. What happens if I just walk away, put everything back and pretend I never found it? Dr. Chasmoff. Roth's expression was compassionate but firm. That's your choice to make and I would understand it. But I have to tell you that secrets like this rarely stay buried forever. Historical records are being digitized, DNA databases are expanding, and research techniques are constantly improving. It's possible this truth would surface eventually through other means. More importantly, Elena added, there may be survivor families who still don't know what happened to their loved ones. If Frank Brennan participated in specific atrocities, the evidence you found could help provide answers to people who have been searching for the truth for 70 years. Dr. Roth opened another file containing letters from families seeking information about relatives who had disappeared during the war. The desperate hope and persistent grief in those communications was heartbreaking to read. On the other hand, Dr. Roth continued, pursuing this investigation will likely be emotionally difficult for you. You'll learn details about atrocities that most people never have to confront. You may uncover information about specific crimes that will haunt you. And you'll be responsible for potentially destroying the reputation of someone who may have become genuinely remorseful for his past. Sarah looked between Elena and Dr. Benyu. Roth, realizing that they were asking her to make a decision that professional historians and investigators had to face regularly. The choice between comfortable ignorance and difficult truth, between protecting the feelings of the living and honoring the memory of the dead. If I decide to continue, what exactly would happen? Dr. Roth outlined the process. They would complete the examination of the jacket and catalog all the artifacts. The insignia would be compared with databases of known units and their activities. Any identifying information would be cross-referenced with Nazi personnel records that had been captured after the war. If we can determine which specific unit Frank Brennan served with, we can potentially identify the locations and dates of atrocities he may have participated in. From there, We can research whether there are any open cases or surviving family members seeking information. Elena emphasized that the investigation would be conducted with appropriate sensitivity and confidentiality. Nothing would be made public without careful consideration of all the people who could be affected. The goal isn't sensationalism or revenge, but historical accuracy and justice for victims. Sarah asked for time to make her decision, but as she sat in that conference room surrounded by evidence of humanity's capacity for both evil and redemption, she realized the choice had already been made. She thought about Dorothy Brennan's journal entries, the fear that had shaped Frank's life even decades after the war ended. She thought about the families Dr. Roth represented, still seeking answers about loved ones who had vanished. "I want to know the truth," Sarah said finally. "All of it, no matter how difficult it is to face." "Doctor." Roth nodded solemnly. "Are you prepared for what that might mean? If we discover that Frank Brennan was involved in specific atrocities, you'll be carrying knowledge that could affect many people's lives." Sarah thought about the weight of secrets, how they had shaped Frank Brennan's post-war existence and Dorothy's protective behavior. She thought about the difference between hiding from the truth and confronting it, between perpetuating lies and acknowledging historical reality. "I'd rather carry the burden of knowing than the burden of hiding from what really happened." They returned to the conservation lab, where Dr. Shaw resumed her careful work, removing the concealing patch. This time, with Dr. Seven. Roth presents it to provide expert interpretation. They proceeded to full revelation of what lay beneath. As the patch came away completely, the insignia underneath was revealed in its entirety. Dr. Roth photographed it from multiple angles before making his identification. "This is the insignia of the 3rd SS Panzer Division Totenkopf," he said quietly. "One of the most notorious units in the entire Waffen-SS. They were involved in massacres on both the Eastern and Western fronts, including the murder of prisoners of war and civilian atrocities." The room fell silent as the implications sank in. Frank Brennan hadn't just been a German soldier fighting for his country, he had been part of a unit specifically known for war crimes and atrocities. Elena photographed the insignia alongside reference materials for comparison. The match was unmistakable, confirming Dr. Roth's identification beyond any reasonable doubt. "The Totenkopf division was present at several major atrocities," Dr. Roth continued, consulting his files. "They were involved in the massacre of British prisoners at Le Paradis in France, mass killings of Soviet civilians, and numerous other war crimes throughout the conflict." Sarah stared at the insignia, trying to reconcile this evidence with the image of the quiet man who had lived on Elm Street. Is it possible he was just assigned to this unit without participating in the actual crimes? "Dr." Roth's expression was grave. The Totenkopf division was an elite unit. Membership wasn't accidental or coerced. The men who served in it were ideologically committed to Nazi goals and actively participated in the unit's activities. There's no such thing as an innocent member of this particular division. The reality settled over Sarah like a heavy blanket. Frank Brennan hadn't just been hiding unpleasant memories of war. He had been hiding participation in some of the worst crimes of the 20th century. "What's our next step?" Sarah asked, feeling the full weight of what they had uncovered. "Dr." Roth began packing the artifacts carefully. "Now we dig deeper. We research Frank Brennan's actual identity, try to determine what specific actions his unit was involved in during his service, and see if we can connect him to any particular atrocities. The insignia is just the beginning of the story." As they prepared to leave the lab, Elena placed a supportive hand on Sarah's shoulder. "Are you sure you're ready for this? Once we start researching specific war crimes, there's no going back to not knowing." Sarah looked at the jacket, now revealing its true history after 40 years of concealment. She thought about all the people who had been affected by the secrets it represented: Frank and Dorothy Brennan, their neighbors and friends, and the unknown victims of the Totenkopf division's crimes. "I'm ready," she said, though she wasn't entirely sure that was true. "Whatever the truth is, it needs to be faced." Dr. Roth sealed the artifacts in protective containers, beginning the process that would transform Sarah's estate sale find into historical evidence. As they left the university that afternoon, Sarah realized she was no longer the same person who had casually examined a vintage jacket at an estate sale just days before. The patch had been removed, revealing not just a hidden insignia but opening a door to truths that would challenge everything she thought she knew about the nature of evil, the possibility of redemption, and the complex relationship between past and present. The investigation was just beginning, and Sarah was about to learn that some discoveries change not only what we know about history, but how we understand our responsibility to confront it. Dr. Roth's research began with accessing databases that most people never knew existed. Back in his Los Angeles office, he connected with networks of historians, government agencies, and survivor organizations that maintain detailed records of Nazi personnel and war crimes. Sarah participated via video conference, watching as decades of careful documentation revealed the true scope of what Frank Brennan had been hiding. The first breakthrough came when Dr. Roth compared the artifacts with captured German military records housed at the National Archives. The insignia, combined with the German document from Dorothy's wooden box, provided enough information to begin tracing Frank's actual identity and service record. The document you found contains partial personnel information, Dr. Roth explained during one of their video calls. It's a transfer order dated September 1943, moving someone from a training facility to active duty with the Totenkopf Division. The name on the document isn't Frank Brennan. Sarah felt her pulse quicken. What name is on it? Franz Brenner. Close enough to Frank Brennan to suggest a simple anglicization when he created his new identity after the war. Dr. Roth had found Franz Brenner in multiple databases. Born in Austria in 1922, he had joined the SS voluntarily in 1941 and had served with the Totenkopf Division from late 1943 through the end of the war. His personnel file contained details that made Sarah's stomach turn. According to captured records, Franz Brenner was present during the Totenkopf Division's participation in anti-partisan operations in Eastern Europe. These weren't conventional military actions. They were systematic campaigns to terrorize and eliminate civilian populations suspected of supporting resistance movements. Elena, who had joined the video call from her Portland office, provided historical context. These anti-partisan operations were characterized by extreme brutality. Villages were burned, civilians were massacred, and prisoners were routinely executed. The Totenkopf Division had a particularly notorious reputation even among SS units. Dr. Roth shared documents that detailed specific operations Franz Brenner's unit had participated in. The clinical language of military reports couldn't disguise the horror of what had taken place in countless villages across Eastern Europe. In March 1944, Brenner's company was involved in an operation near Minsk that resulted in the destruction of an entire village and the murder of over 200 civilians. In June 1944, they participated in reprisals against partisan activity that included the execution of captured resistance fighters and suspected collaborators. Sarah listened to these revelations with growing horror. Each new piece of information made it harder to reconcile the evidence with the image of the quiet man who had lived peacefully in Portland for 4 decades. How can we be certain this Franz Brenner became Frank Brennan in Portland? Sarah asked. Dr. Roth explained the investigative process. Immigration records from the late 1940s showed that thousands of European refugees had entered the United States with documentation that was difficult to verify in the post-war chaos. Some had legitimate refugee status, others had obtained false papers, and still others had been recruited by various government agencies despite questionable backgrounds. There was a Frank Brennan who arrived in New York in August 1947, claiming to be a German-American returning from visiting relatives in Europe. The timing and basic biographical details match what we know about Franz Brenner's post-war disappearance from Allied custody. Elena had been researching the social aspects of post-war immigration and identity construction. It wasn't uncommon for immigrants to modify their names to sound more American. Franz to Frank, Brenner to Brennan. It's a typical pattern. Combined with the physical evidence you found and the timeline of his arrival in Portland, the connection seems very strong. Dr. Roth had also been in contact with survivor organizations in Europe, sharing information about Franz Brenner's service record to see if any families had been searching for information about him or his unit's activities. We received a response from a survivor organization in Belarus. They have records of families from villages that were destroyed by the Totenkopf Division in 1944. Some of these families have been trying to learn the names of the perpetrators for over 70 years. The weight of this revelation hit Sarah hard. Real families, real people who had lost loved ones, were still seeking answers about the specific individuals responsible for their suffering. There's a woman named Anya Volkov now living in Toronto whose grandparents were killed during one of the operations Franz Brenner participated in. She's been researching her family history and has been in contact with several organizations trying to identify the specific SS personnel involved in destroying her grandparents' village. Dr. Roth showed Sarah documentation that Anya had provided to researchers. Photographs of her grandparents, accounts from survivors of the village massacre, and decades of correspondence with historians and government agencies seeking any information about the perpetrators. Anya's grandmother survived the initial attack and lived long enough to provide detailed testimony about what happened. According to that testimony, SS troops rounded up the entire population of the village, separated the men from the women and children, and then systematically murdered them all. The soldiers burned the village completely and took photographs of their actions. Sarah felt overwhelmed by the human reality behind the historical evidence. These weren't abstract war crimes, but specific acts of violence against identifiable people whose family members were still alive and still seeking justice. What happens now? Sarah asked. Do we contact Anya Volkov? Dr. Roth explained that survivor outreach required careful consideration and professional handling. We don't want to traumatize anyone with incomplete information or false hope, but if we can conclusively establish Franz Brenner's identity and his presence at specific atrocities, then yes, survivor families have a right to know what we've learned. Elena raised another concern. What about Frank Brennan's Portland connections? Are we obligated to inform his former neighbors or community members about what we've discovered? This question had been troubling Sarah since the investigation began. Frank Brennan had been part of a community for 40 years. People had known him, trusted him, possibly even considered him a friend. How would they react to learning that someone they had respected was actually a war criminal? Dr. Roth shared his experience with similar cases. I've been involved in several investigations where war criminals were exposed decades after establishing new lives. The community reaction is always complex and painful. Some people refuse to believe the evidence, others feel betrayed and angry, and many struggle with guilt about not having suspected anything. But most people also express gratitude for finally knowing the truth, even when it's difficult to accept. There's something important about not living with lies, even comfortable ones. Sarah thought about Mrs. Henderson at the estate sale, about Dorothy's journal entries describing Frank's fear and secretive behavior. How many people had noticed that Frank Brennan seemed to be hiding from something? How many had chosen not to ask questions because they sensed the answers might be uncomfortable? The investigation had also revealed information about Franz Brenner's post-war movements before his arrival in the United States. After Germany's surrender, he had been captured by Allied forces but had escaped from a detention facility in 1946. He had then disappeared for over a year before surfacing as Frank Brennan in New York. That missing year was probably spent obtaining false documentation and establishing his new identity, Dr. Roth explained. There were networks that helped former SS members escape justice, sometimes for ideological reasons, sometimes simply for money. Elena had found evidence that other members of the Totenkopf division had also successfully created new identities after the war. It was almost like a pattern. These men would emerge in different countries with anglicized names and cover stories about being refugees or displaced persons. The chaos of post-war Europe made verification difficult. Dr. Roth showed them a map indicating where other former Totenkopf division members had been tracked over the years. Some had been identified and prosecuted. Others had lived and died without ever being discovered, and still others had been subjects of ongoing investigations when they passed away from natural causes. Franz Brenner, or Frank Brennan, lived longer than most. He successfully maintained his false identity for 4 decades, which is actually quite remarkable. Usually, something surfaces much sooner. Sarah studied the timeline of Frank's life in Portland, trying to understand how someone carries such a secret for so long. Did he ever try to make amends? Was there any evidence that he regretted what he had done during the war? Dr. Roth consulted his files. There's no evidence of him ever attempting to contact survivor organizations, make restitution, or provide testimony about war crimes. If he felt remorse, he never acted on it in any way that left a record. Elena added her perspective as a historian who had studied perpetrator psychology. Some war criminals spent their post-war lives genuinely trying to become different people. Others simply tried to avoid consequences for their actions. Without direct testimony from Frank Brennan himself, we can't know which category he fit into. The investigation had also uncovered information about other members of Frank Brenner's specific unit. Several had been prosecuted at war crimes trials in the immediate post-war period. Others had been tracked down decades later through investigations similar to the one Sarah had initiated. 2 members of Brenner's company were tried and executed in 1947, Dr. Roth reported. 3 others were imprisoned and served sentences ranging from 15 to 25 years. Franz Brenner was one of only a handful who successfully escaped justice entirely. Sarah realized that Frank Brennan's quiet life in Portland represented something more than personal deception. It represented a failure of the post-war justice system to hold accountable all those responsible for war crimes.
If we had found this evidence while he was still alive, what would have happened? Dr. Roth explained the legal complexities.
It would have depended on several factors: the strength of the evidence, his willingness to cooperate with investigators, his age and health status, and the specific laws in effect at the time of discovery. But most likely he would have faced deportation proceedings and potential prosecution either in the United States or in the countries where his crimes were committed. Elena pointed out that many elderly war criminals had faced such proceedings in recent decades. The legal system recognized that advanced age doesn't erase responsibility for war crimes. Some men in their 80s and 90s have been prosecuted for crimes committed when they were in their 20s. As their video conference concluded, Dr. Bacher compensated.
Roth summarized their findings and outlined the next steps in the investigation. The evidence clearly established that Frank Brennan had been Franz Brenner, a member of the Totenkopf division who had participated in multiple war crimes before escaping to create a new life in America.
The question now is what we do with this information. We have obligations to historical accuracy, to survivor families, and to the community where Frank Brennan lived. Balancing those obligations requires careful consideration. Sarah ended the call feeling both relieved to finally know the truth and burdened by the responsibility of what to do with it. The investigation had transformed her understanding of Frank Brennan completely, but it had also raised complex questions about justice, forgiveness, and the relationship between past actions and present identities. That evening, as Sarah sat in her apartment surrounded by the evidence that had revealed Franz Brenner's true identity, she realized that the most difficult part of her journey was still ahead.
Knowing the truth was one thing. Deciding what to do with it was something else entirely.
The patch had been removed, the secret had been revealed, but the consequences of that revelation were just beginning to unfold. Sarah was about to learn that uncovering historical truth carries with it obligations that extend far beyond the satisfaction of solving a mystery.
3 months after Sarah first examined the military jacket at the estate sale, she found herself on a plane to Toronto carrying a file folder that contained evidence of war crimes committed 70 years earlier. Dr. Roth had arranged for her to meet with Anya Volkov, the granddaughter of victims murdered by Franz Brenner's unit in 1944. The meeting took place at the offices of the Canadian Jewish Congress, which had been assisting Holocaust survivors and their families for decades.
Anya, now in her 60s, had spent most of her adult life researching what had happened to her family during the war. When Dr.
Roth contacted her about potential new evidence, she had immediately agreed to meet with Sarah. Anya was smaller than Sarah had expected, with silver hair and eyes that seemed to hold decades of accumulated sadness. She greeted Sarah warmly but with obvious nervousness, clearly understanding that this meeting might finally provide answers to questions that had haunted her family for generations. "My grandmother lived until I was 15, Anya explained as they settled into a private conference room. She never stopped talking about that day in 1944. She remembered everything, every detail, every face. She made me promise to find out who the soldiers were who killed my grandfather and my uncle." Sarah opened her folder, feeling the weight of the responsibility Anya had inherited from her grandmother. The evidence that had emerged from her estate sale discovery suddenly felt both more important and more personal than it had during the academic discussions with historians and researchers. "The soldier we've identified, Franz Brenner, was part of the unit that attacked your grandparents' village," Sarah said carefully. "After the war, he created a false identity and lived in Portland, Oregon for 40 years under the name Frank Brennan." Anya studied the photographs of the military insignia and personnel documents that Sarah had brought. Her hands trembled slightly as she examined each piece of evidence. "My grandmother described the insignia the soldiers wore. She said it looked like a skull and crossbones. She never forgot that symbol." Sarah showed Anya the photograph of the Totenkopf division insignia that had been hidden under the patch on Frank's jacket. Anya stared at it for a long moment, tears beginning to form in her eyes. This is exactly what she described. "After all these years, this is proof that we weren't just chasing ghosts." They spent the next 2 hours going through all the evidence together. Anya shared her family's documentation, including her grandmother's testimony about the village massacre and photographs of her grandparents and uncle who had been killed. Sarah provided the timeline of Franz Brenner's service and his post-war disappearance and reinvention as Frank Brennan. "What was he like in Portland?" Anya asked. "Did the people who knew him have any idea?" Sarah described what she had learned about Frank Brennan's life in Portland.
The quiet man who had worked as a machinist married Dorothy and lived peacefully in a middle-class neighborhood. She shared Dorothy's journal entries about his nightmares and fearful reactions to war-related news coverage.
"So he remembered what he had done," Anya said quietly. "He wasn't able to forget, even if he tried to hide from it." Sarah had wrestled with this question throughout the investigation.
Had Frank Brennan felt genuine remorse for his past, or had he simply been afraid of being discovered? The evidence suggested fear rather than guilt, but the distinction might not matter to families like Anya's.
The important thing is that we now know the truth, Anya continued. My grandmother's testimony has been validated. The man who participated in murdering my family has been identified. Even though he's been dead for 30 years, there's a sense of justice in finally knowing who he was.
Anya explained that she planned to share this information with other family members who had been searching for answers. She also wanted to provide the evidence to Holocaust memorial organizations and historical archives to ensure that Franz Brenner's crimes would be officially documented.
This isn't about revenge against a dead man, she said.
It's about historical truth and making sure that what happened to my family is properly recorded and remembered. The meeting with Anya helped Sarah understand one dimension of the complex moral questions her discovery had raised. For survivor families, knowing the truth provided a form of closure even when legal justice was no longer possible. The evidence mattered not because it could punish Franz Brenner, but because it validated the suffering of his victims and honored their memory. But the Portland dimension of the story remained more complicated.
After returning from Toronto, Sarah faced the question of whether and how to inform Frank Brennan's former neighbors and community about what she had discovered. Elena had been researching this aspect of the situation and had found that several people who had known Frank were still alive and living in the Portland area.
Mrs. Henderson from the estate sale was among them, as were neighbors who had lived on Elm Street during Frank's years there.
The question is whether they have a right to know the truth about someone they thought they knew, Elena explained during one of their discussions, and whether learning the truth will help or harm them at this stage of their lives. Henderson, who had been so protective of Dorothy's memory at the estate sale. If anyone had suspected that Frank was hiding something significant, it might have been someone who had known the couple well.
She arranged to meet Mrs. Henderson at a coffee shop, explaining only that her research into the estate sale purchases had revealed some historical information that might be of interest. Mrs. Henderson arrived with obvious curiosity about what Sarah might have learned. Sarah approached the revelation carefully, starting with the historical significance of the military jacket and gradually introducing the evidence about Franz Brenner's true identity and war crimes. She watched Mrs. Henderson's expression change from interest to disbelief to horror as the full scope of the discovery became clear.
"That's impossible," Mrs. Henderson said initially. "Frank Brennan was one of the kindest men I ever knew.
He helped everyone in the neighborhood, never said a harsh word about anyone." Sarah showed her the evidence, the same documentation she had shared with Anya Volkov.
She explained the research process and the collaboration with war crimes experts who had verified the findings.
Henderson studied the photographs and documents with the same careful attention she had given to pricing items at the estate sale. Gradually, her denials gave way to a painful acceptance of what the evidence proved.
Dorothy knew something, Mrs. Henderson said finally.
She never said anything directly, but there were things about Frank that never quite made sense. The way he reacted to certain topics, his reluctance to talk about his past, the careful way he monitored what people said around him. She described incidents she had witnessed over the years, moments when Frank's behavior had seemed odd or excessive, his extreme reaction to a neighborhood dispute involving a German immigrant family, his insistence on leaving social gatherings whenever conversation turned to European politics or war history. "Dorothy once told me that Frank had nightmares where he spoke in German," she said. He claimed he had picked up some of the language during the war, but she always seemed uncertain about that explanation. Mrs. Henderson's response helped Sarah understand how communities adapt to living with secrets they don't fully recognize. People notice inconsistencies and unexplained behaviors, but they often choose comfortable explanations rather than pursuing uncomfortable questions. "What are you going to do with this information?" Henderson asked. Sarah explained that the evidence had already been shared with Holocaust researchers and survivor organizations. Anya Volkov and other family members of Franz Brenner's victims now had the answers they had been seeking for decades. As for the Portland community, that's more complicated. People have a right to know the truth, but they also have a right not to have their memories of someone they cared about destroyed unnecessarily. Mrs.
No, but just...
Henderson thought about this for a long moment. "I think the truth matters more than our comfort," she said finally. "Frank Brennan, or whoever he really was, lived among us for 40 years. We welcomed him into our community. We trusted him. We cared about him. If he was responsible for terrible crimes, we should know that. It doesn't mean we stop caring about Dorothy or stop remembering the good things Frank did in Portland, but we should know who he really was." Over the following weeks, Sarah had similar conversations with other people who had known Frank Brennan. The reactions varied widely.
Some refused to believe the evidence, insisting that there must be some mistake or misidentification. Others accepted the truth but struggled to reconcile it with their personal memories. A few admitted they had always sensed something secretive about Frank but had never imagined the scope of what he might have been hiding. The revelation had a profound impact on the neighborhood where Frank and Dorothy had lived. Some residents felt betrayed, others felt foolish for not having suspected anything, and many wrestled with questions about how well anyone can truly know another person. Elena documented these community reactions as part of her ongoing research into how Holocaust revelations affect contemporary American communities. What your discovery illustrates is that the Holocaust wasn't just a European tragedy that ended in 1945, she explained. It had long-term consequences that continued to play out in communities around the world for decades afterward. Dr. Roth shared the Portland findings with other researchers, contributing to a broader understanding of how war criminals successfully integrated into American society after World War II. The case became part of ongoing documentation efforts designed to ensure that Holocaust history included not just the immediate perpetrators and victims, but the complex aftermath of how crimes and secrets shaped communities for generations. Sarah found herself changed by the experience in ways she hadn't expected. Her casual hobby of buying and reselling estate sale items had evolved into a deep appreciation for the weight that historical objects can carry. She continued attending estate sales but with a different perspective on the stories that ordinary objects might tell. 6 months after her initial discovery, Sarah received a letter from Anya Volkov. Anya had visited the Memorial Museum in Belarus that documented her grandparents' village, and Franz Brenner's name was now included among the identified perpetrators listed there. She had also connected with other families whose relatives had been killed by the Totenkopf division, sharing the evidence that Sarah's investigation had uncovered.
You gave my family something we never thought we would have, Anya wrote.
Not justice in a legal sense, but acknowledgement and truth. My grandmother's testimony has been validated, and the world now knows that Franz Brenner was responsible for the deaths of innocent people. That matters more than you might imagine.
Sarah kept Frank Brennan's military jacket, though she removed it from sale and placed it instead in a climate-controlled storage container. Elena had suggested that it might eventually belong in a museum or historical archive, serving as evidence of how war crimes investigations can continue decades after the crimes were committed.
The wooden box and its contents had been donated to the Simon Wiesenthal Center, where they became part of an ongoing research collection. Roth had indicated that the evidence might prove useful in other investigations, as networks of war criminals had often helped each other create false identities and escape justice. Dorothy Brennan's journal remained with Sarah, a complex document that told the story of a woman who had probably suspected more than she admitted, even to herself. The entries provided insight into how families cope with secrets they don't fully understand, and how love can coexist with willful ignorance. As Sarah reflected on the entire experience, she realized that the most important lesson hadn't been about history or war crimes, but about the nature of truth itself. The patch on Frank Brennan's jacket had concealed more than just a military insignia. It had hidden decades of pain, fear, and unresolved guilt that had shaped not only Frank's life, but the lives of everyone around him. The removal of that patch had revealed not just a symbol, but a web of connections between past and present, between individual choices and community consequences, between historical events and personal responsibility. Sarah had learned that some truths demand to be uncovered, regardless of how comfortable or uncomfortable they make people feel. The estate sale where the story began had been advertised as a simple downsizing event, the dispersal of one elderly woman's accumulated belongings. But it had actually been something much more significant, the final unraveling of a secret that had shaped decades of hidden fear and willful ignorance. Sometimes the most ordinary objects carry the most extraordinary truths. Sometimes the people we think we know best are the ones we don't know at all. And sometimes the past refuses to stay buried no matter how many patches we use to cover it up. Sarah continued to attend estate sales, but she never again examined a vintage military jacket without wondering what secrets might lie hidden beneath its surface. The truth, she had learned, has a way of surfacing when we least expect it, bringing with it all the complex moral obligations that come with knowledge we didn't ask for but can't unknow. Frank Brennan's fearsome past had finally been revealed 70 years after he had tried to bury it beneath a simple fabric patch. The ordinary had indeed revealed something extraordinary, something that would continue to influence the understanding of history, community, and individual responsibility for generations to come. What seemed ordinary, the patch revealed a fearsome past.